He returned home later than usual that evening. The street outside was quiet, almost unnervingly so, with only the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves whispering across the cracked sidewalks. He paused for a moment at his doorstep, feeling the cold metal of the keys against his palm, their familiar weight grounding him in the world he knew. The air carried the faint scent of rain, damp and earthy, lingering from earlier in the day, and it brushed lightly across the back of his neck, raising goosebumps that he quickly shook away. Inside, the apartment welcomed him with its usual stillness. The faint smell of cleaning detergent mingled with the subtle residue of last night's coffee, the aroma lingering in the corners where sunlight couldn't reach. He set his keys down with deliberate care on the counter, the small clink echoing against the quiet walls. Each sound seemed louder than it should have been, and for a moment, he paused, listening. The refrigerator hummed steadily in the background, a sound so mundane he barely noticed it most days. But tonight it had a certain weight, a steady, almost insistent presence. He removed his shoes, the carpet fibers pressing softly under his toes. The texture, so familiar and ordinary, was grounding. He moved to the living room, letting the subtle creaks of the wooden floorboards guide his steps, each one familiar, each one carrying the same gentle reassurance he relied upon daily. Sunlight filtered weakly through the thin curtains, creating soft patterns on the walls and floor, shifting imperceptibly with the evening light. He noticed it for the first time, the way the shadows stretched differently tonight, the way a small corner of the room seemed darker than it should be, though the source was no more than ordinary sunlight. Sitting in his usual chair, he allowed his thoughts to drift. The apartment was quiet, calm, ordinary. Nothing demanded attention, nothing promised disruption. Yet, somewhere at the edge of his awareness, a subtle tension began to form. Perhaps it was the unfamiliar angle of the light, or the brief, almost imperceptible movement in the corner of his eye, dismissed instantly as a trick of perception. Still, a faint disquiet lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He breathed slowly, deliberately, feeling the rhythm of his own chest, the rise and fall anchoring him to the moment. He thought of the day behind him, of the mundane tasks completed and the routines followed. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet, as he settled further into the chair, the apartment felt slightly heavier, more aware, as if it had noticed his presence and was responding in silence. He shook the thought away, reasoning it to be fatigue, imagination, nothing more. But the feeling persisted, subtle and persistent, pressing gently at the edge of his consciousness like a weight he could neither see nor touch. Time stretched quietly around him. The familiar ticking of the clock seemed amplified, each second deliberate, purposeful, reminding him of its steady, relentless passage. The apartment remained ordinary, the hum of appliances constant, the sunlight shifting imperceptibly across the walls. And yet, he could not shake the sense that something was different. Not threatening, not overtly wrong, but quietly, insistently altered. Something had changed, just enough that the rhythm of the ordinary felt slightly fractured. And in that fractured stillness, he allowed himself to exist fully in the moment, aware of his own perception, aware of the subtle weight pressing against the edges of his mind. Everything was normal. Everything was ordinary. And yet, he felt the faintest sense that the apartment, in its quiet, deliberate presence, had begun to watch. The next evening, he noticed it first as a sound. A faint tap, soft, deliberate, almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep within the apartment. At first, he thought it was the pipes settling, the usual domestic noises that accompanied a building at night. But as he paused, listening, the sound didn't repeat with the familiar randomness of plumbing or the hum of electricity. It had intent. He stood still, the carpet pressing under his feet, grounding him as he strained to hear. The tap came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. His hand moved instinctively to the light switch, flicking it, though the living room was already bathed in the soft glow of the evening sun through the curtains. Nothing changed. The shadows on the wall remained motionless. and yet the sound persisted, delicate and precise, like a presence testing its reach. He moved through the apartment slowly, each step measured, deliberate. The wooden floorboards groaned faintly beneath his weight, amplifying every creak as if the apartment itself had become a symphony of sound. He paused at the doorway of the kitchen, noting the stillness of the room. The refrigerator hummed its usual note. The countertops bore the faint traces of his breakfast, ordinary, mundane, unchanged. And yet, there it was again. Tap, tap. A faint, almost imperceptible rhythm that seemed to draw a line in the air, pointing somewhere just beyond his perception. He considered rational explanations. The ceiling fan? No, it hadn't been on. The radiator? Too far away. Even the sound of the wind brushing against the window panes? Perhaps the wind. He took a deep breath, letting it anchor him. Yet, with each exhale, the sound became harder to dismiss, softer in volume but sharper in insistence, pressing against the edges of his awareness, demanding recognition. He began to notice other subtle discrepancies. A book lying slightly askew on the shelf, where it had been perfectly aligned the day before. The faint smell of something warm and unplaceable, mingling with the lingering scent of detergent. The light shifted differently across the walls, subtle gradients forming in corners that should have been familiar. His mind searched for reasons, for logic, for explanations that would quiet the unease rising in his chest. Sitting down again, he let his fingers graze the surface of the armrest, feeling the texture of the fabric, the familiar resistance under his touch. But even here, the ordinary betrayed him. Shadows pooled more deeply than they should, edges softening in ways that contradicted the evening light. And the sound persisted, tap, tap, like soft footsteps pacing just beyond his field of awareness. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, that his imagination, tired from work and daily routine, was playing tricks. He focused on the steady hum of the refrigerator, the soft patterns of light on the walls, the weight of the chair beneath him. And yet, he could not shake the sense of being observed. The tap continued, measured and deliberate, a subtle punctuation in the ordinary rhythm of his life, as if the apartment itself were testing him, probing him gently, waiting for a reaction. Hours passed, or so he thought. Time felt heavier now, each moment elongated by the persistent, quiet irregularity of the tap. Every small movement, every ordinary sound, carried weight. His own breathing, once automatic, now felt intrusive. Each inhale and exhale reminded him that he was present, that he was alone, and yet not. And in the stillness, in the fragile ordinary of the apartment, he realized something faintly unsettling. The world he trusted, the apartment he had always known as familiar and safe, had begun to shift around him. Not violently, not suddenly, but with a deliberate, insistent subtlety that he could not yet define. The first crack had appeared, and though it was small, almost imperceptible, it would grow, he knew, slowly, inexorably, like a shadow spreading across sunlight, until it could no longer be ignored. The following night, the apartment felt heavier, not physically, but as though the air itself had grown denser, pressing against his skin, weighing down his thoughts. The familiar rhythm of his life, making dinner, washing dishes, turning on the television, no longer carried the comfort it once had. Every movement seemed to echo, stretched thin by some subtle tension he couldn't yet define. It began again, softly. Tap, tap. He froze mid-step in the hallway, the spatula still in his hand. The sound seemed to originate from no particular place, yet it felt intentional, localized, as if someone, or something, were testing the boundaries of his perception. He wanted to convince himself it was the plumbing, or perhaps a draft shifting objects slightly. But even as he considered these explanations, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. The tap was deliberate, patterned, too regular to be coincidence. He walked slowly through the apartment, fingertips brushing against the smooth surfaces of the counters, the cool metal of the refrigerator handle. Every texture felt exaggerated tonight, the softness of the carpet, the slight roughness of the wall paint, the polished cold of the wooden floor. Each sensation anchored him in the present, yet heightened the awareness of the subtle, insistent tap echoing through the rooms. He paused at the living room window, watching the streetlights outside flicker against the darkened buildings. There was nothing unusual in the outside world. No movement, no noise. And yet the tap continued, steady, measured, almost conversational, as if it had been waiting for him to notice, to acknowledge its presence. A creeping realization began to take hold. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't a malfunction or an accident. It was an expression of attention, a pattern repeated with purpose. And the repetition of it, night after night, had begun to establish a rhythm in his mind. It was no longer background noise. It was a presence observing, waiting, responding. He started to notice small changes in the apartment. The rug in the hallway seemed slightly askew. A chair, which he always left pushed under the table, had moved just a few inches, enough to catch the corner of his eye. The faint smell of something, subtle and unplaceable, lingered in the kitchen, warm, almost metallic, like copper, faint but persistent. His thoughts became tangled with doubts. Was he imagining things? Was his mind, tired from work and solitude, exaggerating these minor shifts? Each rational explanation felt fragile, insufficient, as if the apartment itself were resisting logic. The shadows seemed to gather differently now, pooling in corners with a density that contradicted the light. He tried to return to routine. He washed the dishes, humming softly, attempting to convince himself of normalcy. He turned on the television, scrolling through channels without really watching, focusing on the cadence of the tap. It was patient, deliberate, almost polite in its insistence, yet it gnawed at the edges of his mind. He sat down in the living room chair, letting his hands rest on the armrests, and realized he had been holding his breath. The quiet, deliberate tap continued, as though measuring him, counting his reactions, testing the limits of his perception. Each repetition cemented the sense of inevitability, a rhythm that began to echo inside his own chest, syncing with his pulse. It was no longer a sound alone. It was a presence that had embedded itself in the ordinary, mundane cadence of his life. Its repetition had begun to shape his perception of the apartment, coloring the familiar with subtle unease. The world he knew, the life he had taken for granted, was being rewritten gently, inexorably, by the steady insistence of the tap. And yet, he did nothing. He told himself it would pass. He told himself that the sound was nothing, that it was harmless. But in the quiet moments, as he sat listening to the rhythm echoing through his home, he could not escape the feeling that this presence, patient and deliberate, had begun to define the space around him. That it would continue, night after night, until its rhythm became inescapable. He could feel it now in his bones. The apartment no longer simply held him, it responded to him. Every tap, every subtle shift, every faint, unplaceable odor, was a communication he could not yet read. And as he sat there, frozen in the gentle glow of the living room lamp, he understood that the ordinary world he had trusted was quietly fracturing around him. The repetition had become unavoidable, and the presence, patient and deliberate, waited, observing, insistent beyond reason. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, painting stripes across the living room floor. It should have brought relief, the warmth of ordinary light, but he felt none. The apartment remained heavy, suffused with the subtle weight of the night before. Each familiar object seemed altered, almost foreign. The couch cushions compressed differently, the coffee table positioned at a slightly sharper angle, the air carrying a faint, metallic scent he couldn't place. He told himself he was imagining it. Surely, it was imagination. The mind exaggerates, reshapes, fabricates. He walked slowly through the apartment, fingertips grazing surfaces, trying to convince himself of normalcy. The texture of the rug beneath his bare feet was a reassurance, soft, yielding. The refrigerator handle cold under his hand. Yet with every step, every glance, He felt the persistent, imperceptible presence of something else, as if the apartment had begun to hold more than mere objects. Sitting at the kitchen table, he stared at the steaming mug of coffee before him. Steam swirled, catching the morning light, and for a moment he almost allowed himself to believe he was simply tired. But the memory of the tap, the patient, deliberate tap, clung to him. It was not a sound, he realized. It was a measurement, a rhythm imposed upon him. And now, in the waking daylight, he wondered how much of it he had truly heard, and how much he had imagined, but feared even imagining. He thought of leaving, of stepping outside and seeking the ordinary world beyond the apartment walls. Yet a hesitation rooted him to the spot. It was not fear of what he might find outside, but of what he might leave behind. What if the presence, if it truly existed, was connected to him, and leaving would only escalate it? Each rational thought was countered by a shadow of doubt, small but insistent, whispering that any action might worsen the unseen, incomprehensible influence. He recalled moments from the previous nights, the subtle movement of the rug, the chair not quite where it belonged, the faint odor, coppery and unplaceable, that seemed to linger just long enough to register, then disappear. All the small signs, individually insignificant, formed a pattern he could neither name nor ignore. The mind seeks logic, he reminded himself. Every occurrence had a mundane explanation, yet none satisfied the gnawing certainty that the apartment had begun to operate on a rhythm independent of him. He began speaking quietly, almost to himself, as if the act of voicing his thoughts might clarify them. "It's nothing," he said aloud, his voice trembling despite himself. "Just imagination, just tiredness." But the sound of his own words rang hollow. The apartment was silent, yet he felt observed. His heartbeat quickened with the awareness, slow but insistent, echoing the rhythm of the previous night. Questions swirled in his mind. Had he misheard the tap? Or had it always been there, waiting, and only now had he noticed it? Could the apartment itself be alive in some incomprehensible way, responding to his presence, measuring his reactions? Each line of reasoning dissolved under the weight of unease, leaving him suspended between rationality and an instinctual dread he could neither articulate nor dismiss. He tried to ground himself in the familiar. The texture of the mug, the grain of the wooden table, the cool linoleum under his feet, they were all tangible, verifiable. And yet, even as he acknowledged their solidity, he felt the apartment shifting subtly, imperceptibly, as if aware of his scrutiny. Every moment was an experiment, every action observed, measured, and noted. The rhythm of the previous nights, the tap, was now internalized, echoing in his own mind as a pulse he could not quiet. Hours passed in this state of tense contemplation. He moved from room to room, attempting mundane tasks, tidying the counters, stacking dishes, adjusting a chair, but each movement reminded him of the invisible presence. Each gesture carried a double meaning, one for himself, one for whatever else occupied the apartment. Rationality and fear merged, creating a dissonance that left him exhausted yet unable to rest, alert yet unable to act decisively. By evening, he realized he had barely eaten. The day's light faded, replaced by the cold, artificial glow of the apartment lights. Shadows stretched differently than they had in the morning. Shapes that had once seemed stationary now appeared slightly off-kilter, subtly altered, almost breathing in a slow, imperceptible rhythm. The awareness of the tap returned, persistent, insistent, now fused with a deepening understanding that the apartment's strange patterns were not external alone, they were within him, shaping his thoughts, his perceptions, his decisions. And so he sat, quiet, still, waiting, caught between the desire to act and the knowledge that any action might be irreversible. The rhythm pulsed through him now, a patient, deliberate insistence that he could neither name nor ignore. And in that stillness, suspended between the known and the unknown, he understood that the apartment had claimed him, not with violence, not with overt terror, but with quiet inevitability, shaping him as much as he observed it. evening had fully settled, and the apartment was cloaked in muted shadows. The artificial light from the ceiling fixture cast long, diffused reflections across the walls, making the familiar seem strange. He sat at the edge of the sofa, staring at the coffee table. His mind churned over possibilities. Should he leave, call someone, or stay put? Each option seemed trivial, yet he felt a pressure behind his skull, a subtle insistence urging him in one direction. He rose slowly, feet dragging over the rug that felt unnaturally thick, almost like it was absorbing him. The air smelled faintly metallic again, a lingering trace of what he couldn't identify. His hand hovered over the door handle, then pulled back. He had checked the door earlier. It was locked, or so he thought. But a whisper of doubt tugged at the edge of his consciousness. What if it wasn't? What if, by leaving, he would trigger something irreversible? He leaned against the wall, pressing his palm to the cool paint, as if grounding himself in the physical sensation would clarify his thoughts. "It's just precaution," he muttered softly. "I can check again." "It's nothing more than checking." The words reassured him slightly. He wanted the action to be mundane, a simple verification, and yet, with each step toward the door, the rhythm of the tap returned, faint but persistent, echoing inside his skull. Reaching the door, he hesitated, fingertips brushing the cold metal handle. His thoughts spun in loop. Maybe I should call someone. Maybe I should wait until morning. Maybe it's nothing. Each consideration dissolved as quickly as it arose, leaving him with only the decision at hand. He tried to slow his breathing, to center himself, but the apartment seemed to resist. Shadows pooled differently near the threshold, and the faint metallic scent grew slightly sharper. Finally, he chose to act. Calmly, deliberately, he turned the handle and stepped into the hallway. The light was dimmer here, and the familiar creaks of the floorboards beneath his feet sounded amplified, like deliberate statements in the silence. He paused, listening. No tap, no sudden shift, only the soft hum of the apartment's ventilation. He exhaled, a small release of tension, and stepped forward. As he moved, he noticed tiny irregularities. The doorknob of the next room slightly ajar, a picture frame tilted a fraction to the left, the shadow of the curtain falling in a subtly different shape than it had this morning. Each observation might have been normal, random chance, but together they created a sense of anticipation, of expectation. The apartment seemed to breathe around him, a slow, deliberate rhythm to which he could not attune fully. He reached the living room again, feeling the pull of the sofa, the mug still warm on the table, the faint, unplaceable scent lingering. He considered sitting, but a voice, his own or perhaps imagined, urged movement. The tap returned in his memory, insistent. He remembered it vividly now, each interval exact, almost instructional, and he realized the choice he had just made, simple and ordinary, might already be binding him to a course he could not alter. He paused, aware that the evening had grown heavier, the air denser. The metallic scent was stronger now, more distinct, almost sharp against his senses. He inhaled carefully, testing his own reactions, and noticed the faintest vibration in the floor, subtle enough to be imagined, but it wasn't. It was a measure, a quiet insistence that he was being observed, evaluated, counted. And then, in a calm, mundane motion, he returned to the sofa, choosing stillness over action. A rational decision, in his mind, an attempt to regain control. Yet as he sank into the cushions, he felt the apartment itself settle around him, shifting slightly, as if acknowledging the choice. The tap echoed faintly in the back of his skull, now internalized, not external, and he knew with a creeping, patient certainty that the decision to remain seated was the first of many steps down a path from which there would be no return. The room remained quiet. No immediate consequence, no startling sound, no sudden movement. Yet the air itself seemed heavier, more deliberate. Every shadow sharper, every reflection in the glassed surfaces longer. The apartment had not acted. It had waited, and in the waiting, he understood the truth. The ordinary choice, the small, mundane decision, was itself irreversible. He stared at the ceiling, the hum of the ventilation filling the silence. The tap had vanished from the floor, replaced by a pulse inside him, subtle and insistent. He could not ignore it. He could not will it away. And in that quiet acknowledgement, he felt the full weight of the apartment's presence, patient and deliberate, threading into the very rhythm of his thoughts, guiding them toward outcomes he could not anticipate, yet could not stop. He stayed on the sofa, motionless, listening to the subtle rhythm of his own breathing. The apartment seemed to breathe along with him, slow and deliberate. Time stretched, each second lingering longer than it should. Shadows leaned a little more heavily against the walls, corners darker than before, and every reflection in the glass, window panes, picture frames, the television screen, seemed to flicker ever so slightly, almost like hesitation in the light itself. His thoughts circled around the decision he had made moments ago. It was just sitting, just waiting, nothing extraordinary, and yet he could feel the consequence pressing down, invisible but tangible, a quiet weight in the air. The apartment held him in place, not with force, not with threat, but with inevitability. He understood, without a word, without a sound, that some choices do not need to announce themselves. Their effects are felt slowly, subtly, until they are inescapable. He tried to move again, testing the normalcy of the apartment, but even as he shifted, he sensed that the balance had changed. The stillness of the room no longer felt comforting, it pressed in. The hum of the ventilation carried a new tone, faint, measured, almost like a heartbeat. He could hear his own pulse echoing against it, a nervous rhythm overlaying the apartment's patient tempo. He glanced toward the hallway. The door to the bedroom remained closed, just as he had left it. Yet it seemed different, slightly taller, slightly narrower. Not the door itself, but the way the space around it existed. He realized he could no longer trust familiar measurements. His mind, trained to notice the ordinary, now saw inconsistencies everywhere. Each shadow, each line of light through the blinds felt significant, purposeful. The room smelled faintly of metal still, a subtle tang that he could not place. He inhaled slowly, noting how the air seemed heavier with each breath, and felt a tension growing inside his chest, an invisible tether pulling him toward the unknown. Nothing moved, yet everything shifted imperceptibly. A small draft near the window lifted the edge of a curtain, but there was no wind. A vibration ran along the floorboards, but no one walked. He thought of standing, of leaving the apartment, of making a phone call, of anything that could restore control. And each time, he found himself frozen. The act of decision had already set things in motion. The apartment waited. He understood that what had been ordinary, a simple, almost careless choice to check the door and then sit, was now irrevocable. He turned his gaze to the coffee table. The mug, still warm, seemed different now. Not in shape, not in color, but in the space it occupied. It anchored him to the quiet presence of the apartment. He felt the room stretching, breathing, anticipating, and he understood, with a chilling calm, that nothing would ever be the same. He had invited permanence through a casual act. Minutes bled into hours. He lost track of time. The shadows remained, subtle but insistent, folding into corners and along walls, touching surfaces, lingering in the light of the overhead lamp. The apartment had taken a new rhythm, and he was part of it, woven into its quiet, unyielding pulse. He could not step out. He could not undo the choice. All he could do was remain. His eyelids grew heavy. The hum of the ventilation, the faint metallic tang in the air, the stretching shadows, they all became a lullaby, not soothing, but binding. He sank deeper into the sofa cushions, allowing himself to become part of the stillness. The apartment exhaled, as if satisfied, and he exhaled in response, aware of the quiet permanence settling over him. There would be no dramatic reveal, no confrontation. Nothing would explain what had happened, nothing to rationalize, nothing to understand. The fear was not in a sudden scream or a hidden presence, it was in the inevitability, in the irreversible weight of a decision that could not be undone. He thought of trying again, of moving, of acting, but the energy for that choice had passed. The apartment, patient and deliberate, had claimed the quiet. He understood that some errors are not loud, they are silent, slow, and permanent. As he closed his eyes, the world outside the apartment ceased to matter. Only the waiting remained, the subtle vibrations, the whisper of shadows, the metallic trace in the air. The quiet pressure persisted, relentless in its invisibility. And in the stillness, the last thought formed, precise and calm: I should have checked. The room exhaled again, and the sound of the world, any world beyond this apartment, fell away. Silence claimed everything,